I'm talking about Sweden.
Of violent clashes.
Sweden's gang wars in a series of explosions linked to a gang war.
Sweden was once one of the most prosperous countries in Europe, with high incomes, long life expectancy, and strong social security, serving as a model for others. But how did a country that once had one of the lowest crime rates in Europe suddenly become a battleground for violent gang conflicts? How did the number of armed attacks in Sweden's once peaceful cities surpass that of London? The turning point came in 2015, when Sweden took in over 150,000 people, an enormous number for the country. These individuals were fleeing wars and humanitarian crises at home, but they did not expect to face new challenges in Sweden. The Swedish government initially viewed migrants as people in need of help and generously provided them with housing and financial assistance. However, integrating these newcomers turned out to be far more difficult than anticipated. Back in 2015, Sweden became one of the most attractive destinations for migrants in Europe. Why? Largely because it was one of the few countries where refugees received generous social benefits, housing, and most importantly, financial support almost immediately upon arrival. Migrants believed they would quickly get back on their feet, and the flow of arrivals kept increasing until the country began to feel the strain. Imagine a small Swedish town where, due to the sudden influx of migrants, schools and hospitals were pushed to the brink. In some schools, migrant children now make up as much as 80% of the student body, and teachers struggle to accommodate students with vastly different levels of education and language proficiency. Just a few years ago, these same schools hardly even had Swedish as a second language classes. Now, a single teacher often has to instruct multiple levels of Swedish in one classroom. This rapid demographic shift led to shocking changes in the very structure of society. Today, in some districts of major cities, such as the suburbs of Malmö, over 90% of the population consists of migrants and their families. As a result, so-called no-go zones have emerged, where most residents do not speak Swedish, and local schools increasingly resemble those in developing countries. Native Swedes no longer recognize their own country in these areas. From police officers to teachers, few locals are willing to work there. One lesser-known fact: according to Sweden's Ministry of Justice, since 2015, the country has been spending over $7 billion annually on migrant assistance, a sum comparable to the budget of an entire government program. At the same time, the tax burden on ordinary Swedes has been increasing. By 2020, nearly half of the average Swedish worker's income was being taken in taxes to support social programs for migrants. Sweden, accustomed to steady and measured development, struggled to cope with the sudden strain on its resources. Public dissatisfaction is growing, and more Swedes are openly stating that the country's migration policy needs to be reconsidered. You probably know that Sweden has long been regarded as a model country, but not everyone understands how it got there. It wasn't just luck or a generous welfare system. In fact, Sweden was already a successful nation before it began investing heavily in social benefits. Throughout the 20th century, the country developed a strong industrial sector while maintaining neutrality in both World War I and World War II. While neighboring countries were rebuilding from destruction, Sweden's economy only grew stronger. This path to prosperity was built on hard work, a sense of responsibility, and careful management of resources. Why does this matter? Because before Sweden became one of the most generous countries for its citizens, it first accumulated resources. This success story shaped its approach to social programs. Rather than immediately spending large sums, the government spent years prioritizing economic growth, industry, and exports. By the time Sweden decided to establish an extensive welfare system, its economy was already strong enough to support it. But what changed? How did a country that once carefully allocated its resources suddenly struggle to sustain financial support for migrants? Many migrants who settled in Sweden ended up in underprivileged areas with high unemployment and living conditions far from what Swedes were used to. While welfare benefits covered basic needs, society itself failed to offer them full participation in the country's life. Language barriers, unfamiliar laws, and cultural differences remained major obstacles. As a result, many migrants and their children feel isolated and often turn to gangs, leading to a surge in street crime. Migrants arriving in Sweden face serious challenges. The first is language isolation. Many do not speak Swedish, which makes even basic communication with neighbors difficult, let alone finding a job. Few can afford quality language education, and the available free courses are insufficient to meet the demand. Take Rinkeby, a suburb of Stockholm. Once a relatively prosperous neighborhood, today 90% of its residents are migrants. Unemployment there is 3 times higher than the national average, and school performance is among the lowest in the country. Imagine this: In local classrooms, only 40% of students can carry a basic conversation in Swedish. Children of migrants remain trapped in a cycle of isolation where their parents do not speak Swedish, and their peers, also children of migrants, offer no way out of this social bubble. Despite numerous welfare benefits, up to 60% of migrants in Sweden remain unemployed, meaning they are almost entirely dependent on government support. More than 70% of adult migrants who arrived in 2015 are still jobless. Although they are technically eligible for employment, barriers such as language skills and lack of social connections make it difficult. In Sweden, job opportunities often come through personal recommendations and networking, making it especially hard for migrants to break into the labor market. As a result, around 80% of migrants end up concentrated in so-called social ghettos, isolated districts in major cities with limited access to stores, schools, and proper recreational spaces. In these areas, children grow up dependent on welfare, having never seen an alternative way of life. Sweden has become one of the few countries in Europe where the term second-generation migrants does not refer to fully integrated citizens, but rather to individuals who still feel like outsiders. With this level of social isolation and a lack of access to jobs or quality education, how long can migrants remain mere bystanders in Swedish society? Today, Sweden has the third highest rate of armed attacks in Europe, and much of this violence is driven by criminal gangs, most of which are made up of second-generation migrants. Young people from impoverished suburbs, left without opportunities, are increasingly drawn into a life of crime. This has led to gang wars that go beyond street fights. These groups now infiltrate politics, manipulate the economy, and generate millions of dollars through illegal activities. Many of Sweden's migrant-dominated neighborhoods have become places where even the police fear to enter. Criminal organizations from these areas engage in brutal turf wars over control of territory and resources. They easily recruit teenagers and young adults from the second generation of migrants, individuals raised in isolated communities where schools struggle and unemployment reaches record highs. In 2022, in one such area, Tensta, on the outskirts of Stockholm, nearly 10 explosions occurred in just 6 months. These attacks were part of an ongoing gang conflict over territorial control. Explosive devices were planted not only near rival gang members' homes, but also at businesses that refused to pay extortion fees or grant criminals access to their operations. Tensta has turned into a war zone where, even in broad daylight, people are afraid to step outside. In 2020, Sweden recorded approximately 260 shootings, a record high for a country once considered one of the safest in Europe. According to police data, more than 80% of those involved in these conflicts were young migrants or their children living in low-income areas. When it comes to serious crimes, over half of those serving long prison sentences are first- and second-generation migrants. This isn't just statistics, it's a harsh reality that alarms ordinary Swedes and disrupts their way of life. In fact, criminal groups from migrant neighborhoods control not only drug trafficking, but also the so-called shadow economy, earning hundreds of millions of dollars through illegal operations. One example is financial fraud, which has become widespread among gangs in the suburbs of Stockholm and Gothenburg. These schemes involve forged documents, fake companies, and even hacking into government systems. Can the authorities regain control of the situation, or has Sweden already entered an irreversible phase of change? Swedish society is beginning to realize that past migration policies have been ineffective. The new government is taking steps to tighten entry regulations, increase oversight of welfare benefits, and promote integration by making language education mandatory for children from mixed background families. Political parties that once supported open border policies are now reconsidering their stance. Sweden now stands at a turning point. The government is passing laws to make it more difficult to obtain refugee status and reduce welfare benefits, which will no longer cover 100% of migrants' expenses. One of the key measures is mandatory early language education for migrant children to break the cycle of linguistic and cultural isolation, starting as early as preschool. Previously, in suburbs like Malmö and Tensta, many migrant children spoke only their parents' native language and struggled with Swedish in school. Now, a mandatory minimum of 15 hours per week in preschool has been introduced to ensure these children start learning Swedish as early as possible. The government hopes this will help them adapt more successfully and avoid social marginalization in the future. Sweden is also introducing stricter welfare policies. Migrants who do not actively seek employment will receive minimal financial support. In 2022 alone, this new approach led to the denial of extended social benefits for 15% of working-age migrants who failed to prove they were actively looking for jobs. This decision sparked criticism from human rights advocates, but the authorities remained firm, insisting that the reform is necessary to encourage self-sufficiency among migrants. The Swedish government has backed an initiative to allocate budget funds for special police units dedicated exclusively to combating crime in migrant-dominated neighborhoods. Over the past 2 years, the number of these units has doubled. However, according to police officers themselves, progress has been limited. To truly enter these crime-ridden areas, they need not only additional funding, but also cooperation from local residents, something that remains largely absent. Can the new government tackle the challenges that have already shaken the country and its way of life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.